I remember the way the light came through the lace curtains that morning. It was my granddaughter's birthday. 25, I believe, and I had folded the check into a pale blue envelope, sealing it with a gold sticker I'd kept for special occasions. The card had a watercolor lily on the front and said something bland about joy and wishes, but I'd written something personal inside. I told her how proud I was, how I remembered the day she was born, like it had just happened, how I used to rock her on my chest and whisper lullabies while her tiny fists clung to my nightgown. I ended the note by telling her this money was for her wedding, to make sure it would be beautiful, because she deserved beauty. It was a large check, larger than I ever thought I'd give away in a single moment, but it felt right then. Or maybe it felt like my role, like something I was supposed to do. I pressed the envelope into her hand after dinner, my thumb brushing hers like a quiet blessing. She glanced down at it with a vague smile and said, "Oh, thanks, Grandma." No hug, no eye contact. She turned back to her phone before I'd even had the chance to tell her how much it meant to me. The family had already started talking over one another again, loud and fast, as if my presence were just a faded photograph hanging on the wall, nostalgic, irrelevant, and easy to ignore. I sat there smiling as best I could, pretending the warm sting behind my eyes was just pride. Maybe she was distracted, I told myself. Maybe she was overwhelmed. That's what I always told myself. I watched as she tucked the envelope into her purse without a second glance. The weight of it was so heavy in my heart and yet so light in her hands. That was the first moment I realized something had shifted. I wasn't the center of her world anymore. I wasn't even part of the scenery, just a fixture, a bank, a body that showed up for birthdays and left before the selfies were taken. But I bit my tongue and smiled. I always smiled, because that's what you do when you're the one who raised them. You give them the best pieces of yourself and hope they remember where it came from. That night, as I folded the napkins back into the drawer and rinsed out the glasses, I found the candle from her cake half burned and curled, forgotten in the sink. I held it for a moment before throwing it away. A birthday wish. What did she wish for, I wondered? Did she wish for me to stay in her life or to quietly drift away? The whispers weren't meant for me. They never are they? When you reach a certain age, people assume your ears stop working the moment your hair turns silver. That afternoon, I was in the hallway moving slowly, carefully, the way you do when your bones creak more than they used to, and I heard my granddaughter's voice from the kitchen, light breezy, filled with laughter. I paused not out of curiosity, but out of instinct. There was something in her tone that made my chest tighten, something too casual to be innocent. "She's too senile to understand money anyway," she said, followed by a small laugh, sharp and mean in its lightness. I heard the clink of a mug on the counter, a drawer sliding shut, and then her fiancé's voice chuckling low. "At least she's good for something," he added. They both laughed again. That laugh, it scratched at me like a loose thread on an old sweater I couldn't quite reach. I backed away before they noticed me. My hands were shaking slightly, not from age, but from the heat rising in my chest. Senile. That word clung to me like a burr, coarse, itchy, degrading, as if years of sacrifice and careful budgeting, decades of managing a household and raising children suddenly meant nothing. I didn't storm in. I didn't cry. I simply walked back to my room, sat on the edge of the bed I'd slept in since I was a young wife, and folded my hands in my lap. I stared at the little framed photo of her on my dresser, the one of her at 5 years old, smiling with cake on her nose, and I wondered when exactly I'd become a joke. I'd always known she was growing up. I knew she'd change. But there's a kind of pain that comes, not when someone stops needing you, but when they pretend they never did. And I had paid for her ballet classes. I had sewn costumes by hand. I had made chicken soup at midnight when she was fevered and sobbing. I had prayed for her health. I had shielded her from storms and from her mother's moods, and now in the quiet space of adulthood, her voice had grown careless enough to laugh at me when she thought I wouldn't hear. But I did hear. I heard every syllable, and I remembered. That's the funny thing about senility, how they assume forgetting is all we do. What they never consider is what we choose to remember. That night, I wrote the word down in my journal, just one word, senile. I underlined it. I stared at it until it blurred, and then I turned the page, closed the book, and went to sleep. Not peacefully, but alert in a way I hadn't felt in years. Something had cracked open, and from that fracture a quiet awareness began to bloom. Not rage, not yet, just a silence that listened, and a silence that would one day speak back. I stopped being invited to the planning meetings somewhere along the way. There was no dramatic announcement, no harsh words, just a slow, polite forgetting. I would call to ask how things were going, and my daughter would say, "Oh, we already decided on that," or "Don't worry, it's all under control." The florist had been chosen. The menu finalized. The colors were lavender and gold, apparently. I'd never been fond of gold. It felt too cold and showy, but no one asked. They'd talk about cake tastings and venue tours and dress fittings as if I were a stranger in the room, someone whose job was simply to smile and nod and occasionally open a checkbook. I tried once to ask if I could help with the centerpieces. I love arranging flowers, always have. My daughter replied gently, "That's really more the planner's job now, Mom. Let's not overwhelm things. Overwhelm things." As though my presence was a risk. As though I, who had once planned every family Christmas, every school recital, every neighborhood gathering, would somehow ruin a single evening just by being involved. I would sit in my own kitchen with a cup of tea, listening to the distant rhythm of laughter from my daughter's phone calls. Sometimes she was even sitting at my table chatting animatedly with her daughter while I watched her lips move my name never spoken. I was background noise, a lamp turned on in the corner of the room, the kind you forget to switch off because you forgot it was ever doing anything in the first place. I remember once I made a list of questions I wanted to ask about the music, the seating, the readings. I folded it into my purse and waited for the right moment. But the right moment never came. She was always rushing out or halfway through another call, and I never wanted to seem pushy. One afternoon, after they'd left in a whirlwind of perfume and car keys, I opened the note, smoothed it with both hands, and quietly threw it away. I told myself I was being silly, that it wasn't about me. But it was. Weddings are never just about two people. They're about families, roots, history, continuation. I wasn't asking to run things. I just wanted to feel included, to feel seen. They say the elderly become invisible, but no one tells you how quickly it happens. One day you're hosting birthdays, and the next you're told the party's somewhere else, and they'll drop by later. They still let me pay, though. Always that. The money still had a seat at the table, even if I didn't. That quiet realization how my love had been reduced to dollar signs sat like a cold stone in my stomach. I no longer felt generous. I felt used, and yet I said nothing. I kept setting out fresh fruit bowls when they came to visit, kept smiling at their plans, kept nodding politely while inside a slow shift began, something that tasted less like sadness and more like strength, building in the dark, like roots reaching for water. It was the invitation I never got that hurt the most. The rehearsal dinner, something small, they said, just immediate family. But I was immediate family, wasn't I? I had been there since the very first breath, since the first tooth, since the sleepless nights and the scraped knees. I had held her tiny hand through storms and surgeries, through heartbreaks and exams. So when my neighbor casually mentioned the lovely vineyard dinner planned for Friday, I smiled as if I already knew. But I hadn't. No one had told me. No email, no phone call, not even a passing mention. I stood there on the front steps clutching a watering can, nodding along like a woman who hadn't just realized she wasn't part of the inner circle anymore. I went back inside, set the watering can in the sink, and leaned on the counter for a long time. The silence was thick. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the old clock above the stove, and my own breath slower now, heavier. I told myself it was a mistake, a slip, that someone had surely meant to call. But when I brought it up later, casually, as we folded laundry together, my daughter just said, "Oh, it's going to be a bit tight. Just bridal party and parents of the groom, really." And I froze. Parents of the groom, not parents of the bride. Not grandparents, not the woman whose savings were financing half the event. I swallowed that ache like dry bread. No tears, just silence. I nodded, folded a towel, and excused myself to lie down. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling fan, turning slow revolutions, each one, like a hand sweeping away a piece of me. I thought about the dinners I'd hosted in that same kitchen, the way I used to light candles and make centerpieces out of garden flowers. The laughter, the music, the sense of occasion. All of it had faded into the walls like old wallpaper. I was a relic now, a well-meaning antique they didn't know what to do with. Later, I heard my granddaughter on the phone giggling about table arrangements and signature cocktails. I couldn't help but think, if I wasn't family enough to dine with what was I, a sponsor, a silent investor in someone else's dream, it wasn't about the dinner. Not really. It was about what it meant to be forgotten, to be treated like a charity case with a checkbook. That night I sat at my own table alone, with a plate of reheated soup. I lit a candle anyway, not out of habit, but defiance. If I was going to be invisible, I would at least burn bright in my own company. I raised a glass of water to no one in particular and whispered quietly, to old love and new lessons. It felt like a goodbye, not to them, but to the version of me who waited to be wanted. It was a Tuesday afternoon, cloudy with that soft kind of light that makes everything feel faded, like an old photograph. I was sitting in my chair by the window, knitting a little scarf I'd started months ago and never finished, when she said it. My daughter had stopped by with some fabric swatches for the bridesmaids, although why she brought them I still don't know. She didn't ask my opinion. She didn't lay them out for me to touch or admire. She just kept flipping through them absently, like they were coasters talking about schedules and how chaotic things were becoming. I offered her some tea. She said no. I offered a suggestion about folding chairs at the ceremony. I had seen some beautiful ones at a wedding on television the night before, and she didn't even look up. "Mom," she said, "that's not your role anymore. Not your role anymore." The words fell like a tray of porcelain on the floor. I didn't speak. I just blinked slowly, letting the words settle in my chest like dust. I watched her pick another swatch, something pale and forgettable, and I nodded. That's all I could manage. I was afraid if I opened my mouth, it would all come out. The hurt, the disbelief, the years of silent giving. I had played many roles in my life. Daughter, wife, mother, grandmother, nurse, cook, taxi, therapist, provider, protector. And now apparently I was a relic, outdated, unnecessary, like a wedding veil that no longer matched the dress. I remember looking at her face, the one I'd kissed 1,000 times, the one I'd once wiped tears from, in the dead of night. And now she looked at me as though I were something she had to manage, not love. "We've got it handled," she added, softer this time, as if that would patch the wound. But the wound was deep. Not because I wasn't in charge, I hadn't asked to be, but because she couldn't even see that I still wanted to be part of the world she was building. I watched her leave purse over shoulder keys jingling like tiny bells, and I sat in silence. The scarf in my lap had unraveled in my fingers without me noticing. I thought of all the roles I had played, how I had shaped her life stitch by stitch, moment by moment, without ever asking to be the star. But now when all I wanted was to witness the story I helped create, I was being quietly asked to exit stage left. I set the knitting needles down and stood up slowly, my knees aching the way they always did in spring. I walked to the drawer where I kept old birthday cards, and I opened one from her, a crayon drawing of us holding hands, stick figures smiling beneath a yellow sun. In the corner she'd written, "You're the best part of my life." I traced the letters with my finger. I let the grief settle, and then quietly I whispered, "Maybe I was. Maybe I still am. Even if no one else remembered, I would. And I would begin to reclaim what that meant." The bank felt colder than I remembered, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, a quiet, sterile stillness that clung to everything. I hadn't been inside in months. Most things could be done online these days, but I wanted to look someone in the eye when I asked my question. I walked slowly to the counter, my purse held tightly in both hands, and told the young man behind the glass that I wanted to check the balance on the joint account I had opened for the wedding fund. He typed quickly, too quickly, like I was just another passing chore. His face didn't change when the number appeared on the screen, but mine did. My heart dropped. Not because it was empty, no, that would have at least been honest. It was worse than empty. It had been drained in pieces. Thousands withdrawn here, a check cleared there. Another transaction made from a boutique I didn't recognize. My name was still attached to the account. My money still built the foundation, but someone else had moved in and rearranged the furniture without asking. "Would you like a printed statement?" he asked, and I nodded. I needed to see it in ink, needed the proof to hold in my hands. I sat in the waiting area, flipping through each page, my fingers trembling. They had begun spending without a word before the wedding even happened, before the vows, before a single flower was placed on a table. It wasn't just dresses or cakes or invitations. It was brunches, spa appointments, luxury linens, even a weekend at a beach house. My money offered in love had become their playground. No conversation, no gratitude, just silent entitlement, as if my offering came with no strings and no soul. I left the bank with the statement in my purse and a storm brewing quietly behind my ribs. I walked home in the wind, not noticing how my scarf had come loose or how the air had turned colder. I just walked and thought and remembered. I remembered the stories my mother used to tell me about dignity, about how a woman's silence can be louder than a man's rage, and I thought maybe I didn't need to yell, maybe I didn't need to accuse, maybe I just needed to look at the truth and then decide what to do with it. Back at home, I sat at my desk, laid the statement out like a map, and traced every transaction like a breadcrumb trail, leading to a place I no longer belonged. And then I opened my checkbook, the one I hadn't touched since writing that wedding gift. I didn't write a new check yet, but I looked at the blank space, the lines waiting for my name and signature, and I understood something I hadn't let myself believe until now. They didn't think I was senile. Not really. They thought I was weak, and that was their mistake. It was meant to be a surprise. That's what I told myself, that showing up at her dress fitting unannounced would be a sweet gesture, one of those little moments we'd laugh about later. I imagined her lighting up when she saw me, maybe even hugging me tightly and saying, "I'm so glad you came." I had even brought a tiny sachet of lavender from the garden tied with ribbon, something for her to keep in the garment bag. But when I stepped into the boutique, the air shifted. Not a dramatic scene, nothing loud or cruel, just a change in temperature. Her back was to me at first. She was standing on a little pedestal in front of the mirror, the kind they use to make girls feel like queens. Her fiancé and 2 friends were lounging nearby, drinking bubbly water and scrolling through their phones. When she turned and saw me, her smile wavered like a candle in a draught. "Grandma," she said, eyes wide, but not in joy. I didn't know you were coming." I held out the lavender sachet. "I thought I'd stop by, just for a moment." She didn't take it. One of her friends laughed awkwardly, and the stylist asked if everything was okay. My granddaughter looked at me, then around at the room, and then whispered, "Could we maybe do this another time? It's kind of a high-stress day. High stress." I looked at her, at the dress she was trying on, lace and pearl, too much for her frame, too much for my eyes, and I realized I was the intrusion, not the support, not the history, just the out-of-place interruption in a scene meant for others. "Of course," I said, folding the sachet back into my purse with fingers that suddenly felt stiff and foreign. "I understand." But I didn't. Not then. I left quietly, walking back to the car with small, even steps, the kind that hold in emotion the way a cracked teacup holds the last bit of tea. I sat behind the wheel and stared through the windshield. I thought of all the dresses I'd helped her pick out as a child. Easter bonnets. School plays. That little red velvet one for Christmas when she was 5. I remembered how she used to twirl for me, laughing, asking, "Do I look like a princess grandma?" And now here she was on the verge of becoming a bride, and all she saw me as was stress. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just rested my hand over my heart and whispered, "Yes, darling, you do." Even if she didn't hear it, even if she no longer needed me to say it. But that drive home changed something. It chipped away at the last bit of illusion I'd been clinging to, the fantasy that maybe I was still part of her foundation, that maybe, despite everything, I still mattered in the most sacred parts of her life. I wasn't just excluded anymore. I was inconvenient, and something inside me began to harden, not with bitterness, but with a new kind of clarity. The kind that says, if they don't see you, maybe it's time to stop showing up for free. It was over tea that the fog began to lift. Not the kind of tea you brew for company with fancy saucers and tiny spoons, but the kind you steep for comfort, deep, earthy, and strong. I had invited a few of my oldest friends over that Sunday afternoon, women who had known me long before I was anyone's mother, anyone's grandmother. We sat around the same table where I'd once iced birthday cakes and mended school uniforms, and we talked the way only old friends can, without pretense, without needing to explain our silences. I didn't plan on saying much. I never do. But something in the way Joan looked at me, a softness, a knowing, unlocked the door I'd been leaning against. "You're quieter than usual," she said, gently pouring honey into her cup. Is it the wedding? I don't know how she knew. But maybe women like us always know. So I told them. Not every detail, not yet, but enough. Enough that their eyes softened and their brows furrowed, and their hands reached out across the table in that way that says, "I see you. I remember who you are." They didn't offer platitudes. They didn't try to make excuses for her or suggest I was overreacting. No, they did something rarer. They reminded me of my story, of who I had been before this chapter, before this sudden diminishing. "You used to host the most beautiful garden parties," Margaret said. "Remember the year it rained and you moved everything into the garage with candles and quilts? It was magical, and you were the only one who stood up to the principal when they tried to cut the music program," Joan added. "You fought for everyone else's kids like they were your own." I sat there, my tea untouched, and I let their words wash over me like warm sunlight on brittle skin. I remembered those moments. I had forgotten how fierce I could be. How generous, yes, but also how steady, how brave. Somewhere along the line, I'd started believing that aging meant becoming less, as though the longer you lived, the more you owed everyone else your silence. But in that circle of weathered hands and kind eyes, I felt something stir. Not anger, not grief, something simpler. Recognition. I had allowed them, my daughter, my granddaughter, to write a version of me that served their comfort. A woman too fragile, too soft, too outdated to question where the money went or why her presence was inconvenient. But that wasn't the real me. That wasn't even close. My friends reminded me that I had built this family with my own bare hands, that I had poured decades of labor and love into its bones, that the wedding fund wasn't a gift from someone desperate to be included, it was a gesture of love from someone who had already earned her place. I didn't tell them what I was going to do next. I wasn't sure yet, but as we cleared the cups and folded napkins and hugged goodbye, I felt taller. Not in body, no, my spine still curved like an old branch, but in soul. The kind of tall that comes from remembering you're still rooted, still blooming in places no one thought to look. And I knew then they may have forgotten who I was, but I hadn't. Not anymore. That night, after my friends had gone and the dishes had been put away, I stood in the kitchen and stared at the refrigerator door. It's funny how a refrigerator holds more than groceries. It holds years, memories, proof. There were photos tacked on with mismatched magnets, a school picture from second grade, a family snapshot at the beach, a wrinkled drawing from preschool with the words, "I love Grandma," scrawled in purple crayon. But the one that held me still was the smallest, a faded photo curled at the edges of me holding her, my granddaughter, when she was no more than a few days old. I was in my robe eyes, tired hair a mess, and still I looked happy, glowing even. She was sleeping against my chest, her tiny fingers pressed into my collarbone, her whole body fitting into the crook of my arm like she belonged there, like she had never belonged anywhere else. I touched the photo lightly with one fingertip, and I remembered how it felt her heartbeat fluttering against mine, her breath warm and soft, how the world outside the nursery had seemed irrelevant in those hours. I remembered the nights I stayed up rocking her, so her mother could sleep the lullabies I hummed while walking slow circles on the rug. I remembered every scraped knee, every birthday balloon, every secret cookie shared before dinner. I remembered who I was to her, who I still am whether she sees it or not. But now that photograph hung beside flyers for catering tastings I wasn't invited to, and notes about appointments I never heard about. The contrast made my throat tighten. I opened the drawer beneath the sink and pulled out a small notepad. I wrote down one sentence: "I remember who I was to her even if she doesn't." And then I sat at the table and wept, not because of the money, not because of the wedding, but because that photo, our photo, was beginning to feel like someone else's life, like a book I used to read that no longer belonged to me. Grief is not always loud. Sometimes it sits with you in the quiet, slides a photo under your nose and asks, "Do you still know who you are without them?" That night I made tea and sat with the photo in my lap. I didn't want to be bitter. I didn't want to erase the love that built us. But I couldn't keep living in a house where my history had become invisible. So I made a quiet promise. Not a threat, not revenge, just a vow to myself. If I was no longer welcome in the story they were writing, I would write my own. And I would begin not with anger, but with memory, because sometimes memory is all a woman needs to begin again. The envelope looked just like the one I had given her weeks ago, smooth pale blue sealed with a gold sticker. I sat at my writing desk, the one I'd had since the children were small, and opened my checkbook, slowly, deliberately, like a woman measuring every breath she took. I wrote my name first in the bottom corner, in the same script I'd taught my daughter when she was 10 and afraid of cursive, then the date, then the amount. But instead of filling in a number on the line, I paused. My pen hovered there midair like it too was unsure what to say. This wasn't the same gesture anymore. This wasn't generosity. This was reclaiming. This was quiet justice wrapped in good stationery. I took out the first check, the one I'd given to my granddaughter, and tore it clean down the middle. The sound echoed in my little study louder than I expected. Final. Then I wrote a new check, to myself, for the exact amount I had given away in blind hope, in trust in love. I folded it neatly, slipped it into the envelope, sealed it, and wrote my own name on the front, not out of vanity, but because it was mine. All along it had been mine. They had taken that money as if it were owed, as if I were a stepping stone meant to be walked on, not a foundation to be honored. I didn't need to tell them right away. I didn't need a confrontation. The silence had already said everything they hadn't. But this act of reversal, of quiet rebalancing, felt like an anchor returning to the sea floor. I placed the envelope in the small wooden box where I kept important things, birth certificates, old letters, a lock of my husband's hair. It belonged there more than it ever belonged in a stranger's purse. Later that afternoon, I baked lemon tea cookies. The smell filled the house and wrapped around me like an old song, something I hadn't let myself sing in too long. I thought about calling them my daughter, my granddaughter. I thought about explaining, about trying once more to make them see me. But then I remembered the boutique, the bank, the laughter behind my back. I remembered what it felt like to be erased. And I decided that I didn't owe them a performance. I owed myself a beginning. When I sat down with my tea and one of those warm cookies, I smiled not out of victory but out of relief. For the first time in months, I felt the shape of my own dignity settle back into my bones, not loudly, not like thunder, but like rain soaking into thirsty earth. That check may never be cashed, but it had already paid for something priceless, the return of my self-respect. I wasn't supposed to find out about the venue change. It came up in passing, one of those accidents people make when they assume you're too far removed to matter. My cousin called to ask what time the shuttle would arrive at the old church, and I had to tell her gently that I hadn't heard anything about a shuttle. Her pause was long, awkward. "Oh," she said slowly. "I thought you knew they moved the ceremony to the golf club. Much easier for parking, I think." That word moved hit harder than I expected, as if I were furniture rearranged without notice. I thanked her and hung up, hands trembling slightly as I reached for my reading glasses and pulled out the most recent invitation still magneted to the fridge. The details were all the same. No mention of the new location, no mention of any change at all. But I knew now. The venue had changed. The plans had changed. And so had my place in them. I called my daughter later that day, not to accuse, just to ask. Her voice was cheerful, rushed. "Oh yeah, we moved things around, honestly. It just felt more modern, you know." I said nothing. Then she added like an afterthought, "It's all pretty last minute. You probably wouldn't want to be seated too close to the DJ anyway. We were thinking something quieter, maybe off to the side. Off to the side." The words landed in the pit of my stomach like a stone dropped in still water. I was no longer even near the family table, just some silent ornament to be tucked into a quiet corner if I showed up at all. I hung up soon after, politely, the way we're taught to when we're raised, to make other people comfortable. But when I placed the phone back on the receiver, I sat still for a very long time, I thought of every wedding I had ever attended, every speech I had written, every corsage I had pinned with proud, trembling hands. I thought of how many tears I'd wiped, how many dresses I had altered by hand, because someone didn't have the money to take it to a tailor. I thought of how deeply I'd loved them all, how wholly I had given of myself. And now I wasn't even near the music. I wasn't part of the heartbeat of this moment. I was the background, the afterthought. That evening I opened a drawer and pulled out the RSVP card I had never sent in. I ran my fingers across the lines, blank and waiting for me to say yes, to say I'll still come even if I'm nothing but a ghost in the corner. But I didn't fill it out. I tucked it back in the envelope and placed it on the mantel, still unsealed, still silent. I wasn't ready to answer. But I knew this: if I did attend, I wouldn't be sitting quietly. I wouldn't be offering soft smiles to people who hadn't offered me so much as a seat at the table. I would come not as a ghost, but as a woman who had finally remembered the sound of her own name. There's something deeply symbolic about silverware. The good set, the one you only bring out for holidays or important dinners, was never just about forks and knives. It was about care, about history, about tradition passed from mother to daughter like a sacred ritual. Mine lived in a velvet-lined box, tucked away in the dining room hutch, polished by hand every winter, even when there was no one coming. Each piece had a story. The cake server from my wedding, the soup spoons we used the year my husband lost his job and I made stew for weeks, the butter knives that had scraped dozens of birthday cakes for fingers too eager to wait for a slice. And until a few months ago, I always thought I'd give it all to my granddaughter. It was meant for her. That was what I told myself. She would host the dinners. She would carve the roasts and light the candles and remember in some small way who I had been and what I had given. But something had changed, not just in them, in me. And so one quiet morning, with the light barely crawling in through the curtains, I opened the hutch and began to pack it all away, not to gift, not to donate, but to protect. I placed each piece carefully into its own soft cloth, labeling the bundle with a handwritten tag, "Not for distribution." I don't think I even realized I had written those words until I tied the string. Not for distribution. Not because I was angry, but because I was done giving sacred things to people who treated them like placeholders. They had made it clear that my presence wasn't part of their vision, that my voice, my tastes, my history, none of it belonged in the new world they were crafting. So why should I offer them the tools of my memory? Why should they get the spoons that fed their mother when she had colic? The tongs that served communion bread at our family's first Christmas after the accident? I wrapped each item like a memory, folded and sealed, and tucked them into the chest at the foot of my bed. Let them call me senile. Let them think I forgot what mattered. They were the ones who had forgotten, not me. I remembered everything. I remembered who stood beside me when my husband passed, who whispered their first secrets into my ear, who reached for my hand under the table when they were scared. I remembered every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every time I put myself last so they could feel first. That kind of remembering doesn't disappear with age. It crystallizes, it sharpens, it teaches. And it had taught me this love is not a transaction. It is not a dowry to be cashed out when convenient. And legacy, real legacy, is not just passed down. It's protected. That silverware would not be handed off like some antique obligation. It would wait until it found hands that understood its weight, until it met someone who knew that behind every tarnish was a story worth preserving. I closed the chest, rested my palm on the lid, and exhaled, not out of bitterness, out of release. The first letter started as a whisper in my chest. I didn't intend to write it. I sat down with the intention of organizing bills, maybe making a grocery list, but my hand reached for the thick stationery instead, the kind I saved for birthdays or condolences. And then I began slowly, carefully, as if opening a wound that had long scabbed over, but never quite healed. "My darling girl," I wrote, "you may never read this, and perhaps that's for the best." I didn't try to be poetic. I didn't craft guilt or lace the sentences with anger. I simply told her what it felt like to watch her grow up in my arms, only to be set aside like a worn-out storybook. I told her about the joy of braiding her hair on Sunday mornings, about the secret hot chocolates we shared behind her mother's back, about the way she once cried when I missed a ballet recital. Because I had the flu. Back then I wrote it mattered that I was there. Now it seems to matter more that I stay out of the way. My hands shook as I pressed the pen harder into the paper. Not with rage, but with the kind of ache that comes when your heart has been carefully, thoroughly ignored. I wrote until the pages were full, and then I folded the letter and placed it in a wooden box beside my bed. I didn't label it. I didn't sign it. I just let it sit. The next morning I wrote another, this one to my daughter. The sentences came slower, steadier. "You were so small when I first held you," I began. "So afraid of everything. And now here you are, afraid of me." I told her what it felt like to be excluded from a wedding I'd helped make possible. I told her how strange it was to be a parent still loving from a distance, still waiting for the phone to ring for the smallest invitation back into her life. I didn't ask for apologies. I asked only that one day she remember who I had been before I became a problem, before they turned my love into an obligation. I wrote for days, not to them really, but for me, to get it all out, to lay each wound on paper like a pressed flower, flattened but not forgotten. The pages began to pile up. Some I tied with ribbon. Others I tucked into cookbooks or photo albums, places they might find them someday long after I'm gone. But most I placed into the chest at the foot of my bed, right beside the silverware and the wedding check addressed to myself. This chest had become something else now, a sanctuary, a vault, a quiet protest. I wrote because I could no longer speak in their world. Because when your voice is dismissed enough times, you start building your own language. Mine was ink, memory, boundaries. I did not write for reconciliation. I wrote to reclaim the parts of myself that had been swallowed by decades of giving, and in that quiet act, I found something surprising. I found peace, not the kind that comes from being heard, but the kind that comes from finally listening to yourself. There was no ceremony to it, no dramatic flourish, just a quiet morning over coffee and morning light when I decided it was time. The family trust account, the one I had opened decades ago with my husband, the one that had grown patiently with every carefully clipped coupon and every skipped vacation, was no longer a symbol of love. It had become a leash, a bargaining chip they used without speaking to me, as if my generosity had an expiration date, as if the heart behind it had gone numb. So I got dressed, a simple skirt, soft sweater hair, pinned back the way I used to do when I still attended PTA meetings and Sunday services. I walked to the bank alone, not because I had no one to come with me, but because I needed to remember that I could still stand on my own. The woman at the counter was polite and young, her lipstick too bright for the fluorescent lights, and she smiled, without really seeing me, until I handed her the papers. "I'd like to close the family trust," I said, "and transfer the funds into a new account, sole access, in my name only." Her smile faltered for just a second, eyes scanning the documents. "Are you sure, ma'am?" she asked, not out of doubt, but out of procedure. I nodded. Yes, I'm quite sure. And I was. I didn't need anyone else to approve it. The paperwork had been prepared days earlier after long nights of rereading every clause, every signature. I had built that trust with the idea of legacy, of passing something down with warmth and meaning. But legacy cannot be entrusted to people who no longer respect its roots. I didn't even flinch as I signed the final page. My hand was steady, my breath calm. When it was done, the woman handed me a new checkbook, a small folder with my name printed neatly across the top. I slipped it into my purse. It felt lighter than I thought it would. Outside, the breeze picked up and tugged gently at my sleeves. And for the first time in months, I walked without feeling like something was pressing down on my chest. That afternoon, I made another small decision. I started drafting a new will, not out of anger, not as punishment, but as clarity, as fairness. I didn't know yet who the money would go to. Maybe a scholarship, maybe a cause that fed children, or helped women find safe places to rebuild their lives. Maybe even a stranger I hadn't met yet, someone who would understand the value of a life earned through quiet sacrifice. What mattered was that it would be mine to give again, freely, thoughtfully, not demanded, not expected, not assumed. The final withdrawal wasn't about dollars. It was about dignity. It was about stepping away from the table, not because I wasn't welcome, but because I no longer wanted to sit with people who saw my worth in what I could fund, not who I was. I gave for years, without condition, but now, at last, I was giving to myself, and it felt like spring after a long, bitter frost. The final invitation came in the mail, thin and perfumed, addressed with the same impersonal script, as if it had been printed by a machine. It arrived on a Thursday, tucked among utility bills and pharmacy ads, as though it were nothing more than another envelope in the pile. I opened it slowly, as if the paper might crack under my fingers. Ivory cardstock, gold lettering. The names were bold and beaming. The venue was the new one, the golf club. I noticed that. And in the corner, in soft gray ink, was a small line. Please RSVP by the 10th. I stared at that line for a long time. The words didn't sting. They didn't even feel real. They felt like a test, like someone had handed me a mask and asked me to wear it one last time. Sit quietly, smile politely, give your blessing even when you've been bruised by the asking. I folded the invitation back into its envelope and placed it gently on the mantel. Then I sat with myself, not with tea, not with music, just silence. The kind of silence that fills a house when truth has finally settled into its bones. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I just breathed. Long, slow breaths, the kind that remind you you're still here, still whole. And when the light changed on the wall and I felt the stillness of late afternoon begin to arrive, I knew what I would do. Nothing. I would not return the RSVP. I would not write a note. I would not explain myself. For the first time in this entire unraveling, I would give them what they had given me, silence. Not as revenge, but as release. Silence was not empty. Silence was full of everything I had never said, everything they never asked to hear. In my silence, there would be dignity. In my silence, there would be power. No one would get to twist my words or paint my absence as cruelty. It would simply be mine, a boundary drawn in invisible ink. I imagined the wedding unfolding without me, the clinking of glasses, the scripted speeches, the careful seating chart that no longer had to wonder where to place me. They would call it peaceful. They would say, she must be resting. And they'd be right. I was resting. Resting from years of being reduced, dismissed, misused. resting from performing gratitude when all I felt was grief. That evening I made a simple dinner, soup bread, a ripe pear. I lit a candle, not for them, for me. I watched the flame dance and thought of all the times I had poured my light into others, hoping they'd notice the warmth. And now at last I was letting the light be mine. I didn't answer the invitation. I answered myself, with stillness, with steadiness, with a quiet that roared through every room in the house. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace.